Welcome back. This is Unit 3, and we are going to discuss slavery, secession, and the statehood of West Virginia. So, West Virginia's statehood is one of the most unique political anomalies in all of American history. Born directly out of the Civil War, the state split from Virginia because its rugged Appalachian geography, which we'll talk more about on the next slide, fostered an economy that was reliant on small scale farming and white wage labor instead of that large plantation system. West Virginia's birth was not an accident. It was a geographic certainty. So if you look at the map on this slide, the Blue Ridge and Allegheny Mountains did more than just divide the land. They divided two completely different economic worlds. On the east, you have a flat, fertile tidewater plain, which made large-scale tobacco plantations really profitable. But the system meant they needed huge numbers of enslaved laborers and concentrated immense wealth into a very small class of elite planters. Now look at the west of the mountains into Appalachia. The rugged, steep terrain made plantation farming physically impossible. Instead, Western Virginia developed around small, independent family farms where they did have industry like the salt works in Kanawha Valley or early coal mines, but it relied mostly on white wage labor for those businesses. Because of this, Westerners traded along the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers with Pennsylvania and Ohio. They looked north and west for their future, while Richmond looked eastward towards the Atlantic slave trade, two completely different worlds. Now, geography created the differences, but political corruption turned those differences into basically a revolution. For decades, even before the Civil War, Western Virginians were treated like an exploited colony by their own state capital in Richmond. Under Virginia's mixed basis system, the state calculated voting districts by counting three-fifths of the enslaved population. Since the West had very few slaves, this system guaranteed that a very small minority of Eastern slaveholders held a permanent, unshakable majority in the state legislature, and there was nothing that the West Virginians or Western Virginians could do about it. East Richmond used this power to rig the tax system too. The legislature passed laws making slaves under 12 tax exempt and capped the taxes on adult slaves well below their actual value. To make up the budget shortfall, they taxed the Western properties like cattle, tanneries, mountain farmland, anything you call property at full market value. Now, you got to remember, slaves were considered property. So, how is this fair that the people in the west of Virginia are being taxed full prices and the eastern people who are richer are not? But we are not done with the abuse yet. To add insult to injury, Richmond took that Western tax money and spent it on building canals and railroads in the East, completely ignoring the desperate need for roads in the Western mountains. By 1860, the West was boiling with resentment, understandably. Now, I want to take a minute to clarify a common historical misconception. We have to be very precise about the nature of anti slavery sentiment in Western Virginia. It is a myth that Western Virginia was an abolitionist paradise. This picture is along the Kanawha River in Charleston, and it talks about the reality of the numbers of those enslaved in Western Virginia. Let's look at those numbers. So in 1860, Virginia had nearly 500,000 enslaved people, but fewer than 18,000 lived in the western counties. That means slaves made up less than 4% of the western population compared to 40% in the east. And where slavery did exist in the West, it looked very different. Instead of massive cotton or tobacco fields, enslaved people were clustered in urban river valleys in places like the Kanawha Valley Salt Works or the Greenbrier Agricultural Estates, or hired out as blacksmiths, domestic servants, and deckhands along the rivers. A very different life for those enslaved people. When Westerners spoke out against slavery, it was rarely out of moral empathy for African Americans. Instead, it was based on economic self interest. White mountaineers viewed slavery as an institution that degraded the value of honest white wage labor. They hated the system of slavery because it concentrated all the state's wealth and political power in the hands of the Eastern plantation elite, leaving the white working class of Appalachia, especially, politically powerless, like we already talked about. And then in October of 1859, a national crisis landed right on Western Virginia's doorstep when John Brown raided the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, well, today West Virginia, located at the northern gateway of the Shenandoah Valley. Now, Brown's goal was to seize weapons, spark a massive slave rebellion, and carry the war against slavery down into the South, but he was going to use the Appalachian Mountains as a hidden base. Ironically, the local Western Virginia population did not join him. Instead, local railroad workers, farmers, militia members, they were among the first to fight back against Brown's men before the U.S. Marines arrived. The aftermath of the raid changed everything. It sent a shockwave of panic through the entire state of Virginia. The government in Richmond began aggressively funding and training volunteer militia, preparing for an inevitable war. While this event radicalized Eastern Virginia and pushed them towards the idea of secession, it had the complete opposite effect on the West. Westerners saw that Richmond's growing radicalism was going to drag them into a terrible war, a war that they saw as treason against the United States, and they were very much opposed to that. Now, the breaking point came in April of 1861, right after Abraham Lincoln called for troops to put down the rebellion at Fort Sumter, which is a whole different topic. It's considered the first like firing of the Civil War, so it's a really big deal. It wasn't really North versus South out to kill each other. It was more that arsenal belonged to the Union, but it was in Confederate territory. And so when Abraham Lincoln called to have more weapons brought there, it was kind of like, hey, who do you think you are? It's on Confederate property, not Union, and it's going to start the battle. But I say battle, but it really was a smoke out, and the Confederates will take over Fort Sumter. So it's a scary thing. Nobody's been killed, but it's still a very scary thing. So Richmond's going to call a special convention to vote on whether or not Virginia should leave the United States and join the Confederacy. I mean, what a big question. The atmosphere in Richmond had to have been just terrifying. Sectionalist mobs roamed the streets, threatening anyone who spoke in favor of the Union. When the final vote was cast on April 17th, the Ordinance of Secession passed 88 to 55. But we have to look at where the no votes came from. 42 of the 55 delegates who voted against secession were from the western counties. That's a big deal. The Western delegates knew they were in physical danger, and John S. Carlisle, a fierce Unionist delegate from Harrison County, had to secretly board a train and flee Richmond before the convention was officially closed. As these delegates crossed back over the Allegheny Mountains, they realized that their state government had just committed treason. They decided immediately that if Richmond could secede from the United States, then the West could secede from Richmond. Now, just weeks after Richmond voted to secede, over 400 Unionists gathered in Wheeling, now Wheeling, West Virginia, for the first Wheeling Convention. And the atmosphere, I can't even imagine. It must have been electric and scary and a feeling of danger everywhere. But these massive debates are going to erupt over how fast they should move. On one side, you had radicals like John Carlisle, who wanted to immediately declare an independent state of West Virginia. The other side, more cautious lawyers like Waitman Wiley urged restraint. Wiley warned that a sudden unconstitutional break would be seen as an illegal rebellion by the federal government, and he didn't want that. None of them wanted that. He argued that they needed to wait until the citizens of Virginia voted on the secession ordinance later that month. Wiley's cooler head did prevail. They agreed that if the voters of Virginia approved secession, which everyone knew the Eastern majority was going to do, they would reconvene in June to legally dismantle Virginia's government. How brave are these people? Now, before leaving the convention, they began to create the groundwork for an independent state. They already knew what was coming. So here you have Masonic Hall. This is where that first meeting took place. It was destroyed by a massive fire in 1875, so it's not there anymore. But I can't imagine what a cool building it was originally. And just the craziness of what happened at this Wheeling Convention and the next one that they will have a few months later is just unbelievable. Whether you agree with them or not, the thought that they are willing to pull away from their own state and make a new state to declare we will not commit treason against our own country, that's pretty significant. When the state of Virginia officially ratified secession in late May, the Unionists returned to Wheeling for the second Wheeling Convention. This is where they executed, in my opinion, one of the most brilliant legal maneuvers in all of American political history. So, if you look at the Constitution, it states in Article 4, Section 3, that you cannot form a new state out of an existing state territory without the state legislature's permission. So, let that sink in. Obviously, the Confederate government in Richmond would never give Western Virginia permission to leave, so the delegates changed the game. On June 17th, they issued what's called the Declaration of the People of Virginia. And in it, it says, and I'm quoting, "We, the delegates here assembled, do hereby declare that all the acts of the Richmond Convention, Richmond, are without authority, and that the offices of all who adhere to said convention are vacated." They argued that by joining the Confederacy, the politicians in Richmond had vacated their offices through treason. Therefore, the Wheeling Convention declared themselves to be the true loyal government of Virginia. Now, it's so smart. They elected Francis Harrison Pierpont as the new governor of this restored, and I'm using air quotes, restored government of Virginia. Now, the Union politicians in Wheeling were legally pretending to be the entire state of Virginia. Incredible. They gave themselves the power to grant permission for the West to break away. And believe me, Abraham Lincoln agreed with a smile. Now, over here, I forgot to mention Arthur Borman. So you have a temporary governor in Pierpont. He's the temporary governor of Virginia, but Arthur Borman is going to become the first governor of West Virginia. I felt like that was worth mentioning. Well, there's going to be a glitch, of course. There always is. So even with this legal strategy in place, brilliant strategy, the statehood movement, it nearly died when it reached the U.S. Congress in Washington, even though, of course, Abraham was on board with it. Radical Republicans in Congress, who didn't really like Abe, pointed out a massive hypocrisy. West Virginia is trying to join the Union as a loyal state, but its proposed constitution still allowed slavery. So a lot of congressmen refused to vote for the admission of another slave state. I mean, they're having a war. They're going to have a war. The entire movement was seriously on the verge of collapsing until Senator Waitman Wiley stepped forward with a thing that's going to save it all, this political compromise. So Wiley introduced an amendment that required gradual emancipation. It stated that all children born to enslaved parents after July 4th, 1863 were born free, and older enslaved youth would gain freedom when they reached adulthood. So this is what Wiley said. The admission of West Virginia is a matter of absolute military and political necessity, which, I mean, he's right. I'm getting off his quote here. We must break the backbone of the rebellion by carving this loyal gem from the crown of treason. Isn't that beautiful? So as you can see, Wiley's going to frame this not as a moral crusade, but as a military and political necessity to crush the Confederacy. So of course the amendment is going to pass. I mean, you would be an idiot not to vote for it. So it clears the way for President Lincoln to sign the bill, and on June 20th, 1863, West Virginia officially becomes the 35th state of the Union with the motto Montani Semper Liberi. Mountaineers are always free. Doesn't that just give you chills? Can you tell I love the state of West Virginia? So, of course, we have to take a minute to look at the Appalachian involvement in the actual Civil War. And I just love this picture. Now, they're Union guys now because they're West Virginia. They split apart. So they don't have the full Union gear, of course, because travel to get to them was very difficult. And so they were issued what they could get to them. So they're not going to have that full uniform. But I just think this picture is just such a cool picture. A lot of people do not realize it, but the very first organized land battle of the Civil War took place right here in West Virginia at the Battle of Philippi on June 3rd, 1861. So, Union forces under General McClellan, I don't know if you know his name, but he's one of the big guys of the Civil War for the Union. He knew they had to protect the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which was the primary rail line that connected D.C. to the western states. So, a force of 3,000 Union soldiers, they just executed very coordinated night march, and it ended up being through a blinding rainstorm. And at the end, they are going to catch 800 very poorly equipped Confederate recruits. They took them completely by surprise at dawn. I almost said sunrise. Dawn. The Confederate retreated so fast that the Northern newspapers mockingly labeled them the battle. Wait, hold on, I'm mispronouncing it. The Philippi races. Sorry, they named the battle the Philippi races because the men ran away so fast. That's kind of mean, but hey, they were caught by surprise. So casualties were very, very light, but the strategic impact of this was so massive. Like we can't even measure how massive it is or was. This victory permanently secured the northern West Virginia for the Union, and it drove Confederate forces away from that very vital B&O Railroad, which ensured that the wheeling delegates could meet safely without the fear of being captured. So again, this is considered the first organized land battle of the entire war. Who would have thought that was fought in West Virginia? Nobody knows that. So we're going to talk about the second big battle in West Virginia, but I want to take a minute to have you look at the map here. So in red, you see Rich Mountain side by side with the town of Beverly. Right above that, you see Philippi. I did want to just give you the same map. So you're not real sure which happened where, but here you can see Philippi and Rich Mountain very, very close to one another. And it's only going to be a month after Philippi that the Union is going to strike a very decisive blow at this battle, the Battle of Rich Mountain, again, July 11th, 1861. So Confederate forces had fortified a very vital mountain pass along the Staunton, my husband says Stanton, Parkersburg Turnpike, hoping to block any further Union advance into the state's interior. Now, Union Brigadier General William Rosecrans, I always say his name wrong, led a local pro-Union farm boy named David Hart to guide his men up this hidden, treacherous mountain path during this really heavy, once again, a very heavy rainstorm. Now, they bypassed the main Confederate defenses and attacked them from the flank and from the rear. Totally unexpected. The victory was a total disaster for the Confederacy. It forced them to abandon their position across the entire Monongahela Valley, pushing their front line far to the south and to the east. So, this battle ensured that the restored government in Wheeling was completely secure from military threat. Furthermore, this victory made General George McClellan a national hero. He's going to go toe to toe with Lee a few times. And President Lincoln at the time was so impressed by the success of the campaign that he called McClellan to Washington and gave him command of the entire Army of the Potomac. And that's how he's going to end up going against Robert E. Lee eventually. We don't get into that battle because it's not a West Virginia thing. So sadly, we're not going to talk about it. But look at this mountain range and imagine sneaking around the Confederates by hiking this mountain range in a storm. It's pretty incredible stuff. West Virginians, man, they got this stuff, right? I just wanted to take a minute to talk about Joseph Hart. So the marker you see here actually stands in the yard of the Hart house. Remember, he's the one that helped them find that secret passageway to bypass the Confederates. So Joseph Hart is a grandson of the signer of the Declaration of Independence, too, was an avid Union supporter, and he fled with his family when the Confederates seized the mountain. So their two-story log home gave shelter during the battle and served as a hospital afterwards. And you can see this quote here: surgeons were amputating and dressing wounds. There are a great many limbs being taken off of the wounded soldiers here at their house. Can you imagine coming back to that? But you got to give him credit for doing this. I mean, it's pretty brave to do this, and have the Confederates come after you if the Union guys don't win, right? And now we come to the Battle of Droop Mountain, November 6, 1863. As that war progressed, the Civil War, the fighting began to shift to the southern and western borders of our brand new state of West Virginia. On November 6, 1863, the largest conventional battle on West Virginia soil took place here. So you don't have to know these guys' names. I feel like I'm throwing too many names at you, but just to get the story right, I'm going to say them. You don't need to know them though, so don't write them down in your notes. So Union Brigadier General William Averell, he's going to lead a force of 5,000 soldiers to wipe out the remaining Confederate resistance in the southwestern counties. The Confederates, who were led, again, you don't need to know this, led by Brigadier General John Eccles, took up a heavily fortified defensive position on top of this mountain overlooking the valley. So Averill launched a coordinated assault, sending his infantry on a I mean, I can't imagine how grueling it must have been. Multi-hour march through thick mountain brush, and he's going to end up hitting the Confederates on their left flank while his cavalry slammed into the center of them, cut them in half. So the Confederate lines were totally shattered, resulting in a chaotic retreat. Again, poor Confederates. So the Battle of Droop Mountain effectively is going to break back of the organized Confederate military power anywhere inside of West Virginia. So from this point on, the state government had full military control over its entire territory, and the Confederacy was never again able to launch a major conventional invasion into the state. So this is such an important battle, and you got to remember that these guys, I mean, some of them are the Confederate guys, they're not getting paid. And here they are. The West Virginia people just seem to be so organized, and they just one time after another, just completely demolished the Confederates. So remember, the war is not over in 1863, but they're not coming back to West Virginia after 1863. Now, I want to take a minute to step back from the war and talk about the dark reality of that war for just ordinary citizens trying to live their lives. While the big battles captured the newspaper headlines, daily reality for most citizens in the Appalachian Hills was far more terrifying. This region suffered through a brutal neighbor against neighbor type of guerrilla war. Regular army units were spread thin across the rugged mountains. I mean, it's rugged terrain, so it's hard to have these massive units. They're kind of like, speckled here and there, and they were spread so thin across the rugged mountains, it kind of created a power vacuum, and it allowed partisan groups, some of them called bushwhackers, and you can see the definition here, to terrorize people in the countryside. So these are pro-Union, but there's also pro-Confederate groups. The most famous one I can think of was called the Moccasin Rangers, and they purposely picked Union towns, cut their telephone or telegraph lines, ambushed supply wagons, and local unionists responded by forming home guard units to hunt them down. So you've got total war that's going to divide families. Brother fought against brother. Long-standing family feuds were often settled under the guise of military necessity. If a family was suspected of hosting an enemy soldier, their house was burned to the ground and their cattle was stolen and nobody cared. There's no law. It's lawless. So this bitter guerrilla violence left very deep cultural and social scars across the Appalachian Hills that lasted for decades after the official peace treaties that were signed at Appomattox. So I don't think a lot of people realize that there was a war unto itself happening while the Civil War was raging in Appalachia. And these people had to fend for themselves. Nobody was coming to help them. Now, all of this violence amidst the bravery of what they were willing to do, it's going to change West Virginia and make it a state unlike any other. The birth of this state left a very complicated legacy. When the war ended, the pro-Union state, West Virginia, the government passed laws that stripped the ex-Confederates of their citizenship, their voting rights, and it's going to keep that political tension high for years and years. It's going to take way more than a decade for the restrictions to be lifted and for true political reconciliation to begin. So ultimately, the creation of West Virginia proved that the cultural, economic, and geographic identity of Appalachia was fundamentally distinct, very distinct from coastal plantation south. And the state motto, again, mountaineers are always free, it serves as a lasting monument to a mountain population that refused to be dragged into treason by this wealthy plantation elite that they didn't have any connection to really. And they carved out their own destiny right in the middle of a national civil war. Incredible. Our story is incredible. So if you're not proud of the state of West Virginia, or maybe you don't even live in West Virginia, just know how incredible the people here are. Not just the Appalachia people. All these people had to come together to create the 35th state, the wonderful state of West Virginia.